James Carter stood in front of his mirror, adjusting his tie. The morning sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting stripes of light across the room. Today was no ordinary day. It was his first day as the sheriff of Montville County. The title carried weight, especially for a man like James, a man who had worked his way up through hard work, dedication, and an unshakable sense of justice. James was no stranger to challenges. Growing up in a small town where opportunities were scarce, he had learned the value of resilience early in life. His parents had always told him, "Character is what makes a leader." Those words stayed with him, guiding him through every tough decision he had ever made. As he grabbed his sheriff's badge and hat from the dresser, he felt a mix of pride and caution. Montville County wasn't like the big city where he had worked before. It was smaller, quieter, but with its own unique set of challenges. James knew he was stepping into a position where trust and respect had to be earned, not given. Instead of driving straight to the sheriff's office, James decided to take a different approach. He wanted to see the county from a regular person's perspective, not as the man in charge. So he left his official SUV parked at home and chose to drive his father's old beat-up sedan. The car had sentimental value. It reminded him of the long talks he'd had with his dad about life, integrity, and responsibility. The drive through Montville was peaceful at first. The early morning sun lit up the streets, and small businesses were just starting to open. Farmers waved from their trucks as they passed, and kids waited for the school bus on dusty roads. James smiled, feeling a deep connection to this place already. He stopped at a small gas station on the outskirts of town. The pump creaked as he filled the tank, and the smell of gasoline mixed with the faint aroma of fresh coffee from the station's convenience store. As he stood there, a patrol car pulled up on the other side of the lot. Two uniformed officers stepped out, their eyes immediately landing on James. He noticed their subtle glances at his car and his plain clothes. They exchanged a few words he couldn't hear and started walking toward him. James didn't think much of it at first. Maybe they were just curious about the new face in town. "Morning," one of the officers said, his tone polite but cautious. "Good morning," James replied with a friendly smile. "Mind if we ask what you're doing here?" the other officer asked, his hand resting on his belt. James raised an eyebrow. "Just getting gas." "Why?" The first officer's eyes flicked to the old car, then back to James. "We've had some reports of suspicious activity around here. Just doing our job." James felt a twinge of frustration, but kept his tone calm. "I understand. I'm just passing through." The officers didn't seem convinced. Their eyes narrowed, and their body language shifted. James realized that his first day as sheriff was about to take a very unexpected turn. As he stood there, waiting to see what would happen next, James couldn't help but think about the challenges ahead. This was just the beginning, and he was determined to handle it with the same strength and dignity that had brought him this far. James stood by his car, watching the two officers closely. The air between them felt tense, even though no one had raised their voice. He noticed the younger officer glancing at him with suspicion, while the older one seemed more curious than hostile. "Can I see your ID?" the older officer asked, his voice firm but not aggressive. James hesitated for a moment, debating whether to reveal his identity right away. He decided against it. He wanted to see how these officers treated an average citizen before they knew who he was. "Of course," James said, reaching into his pocket slowly. He pulled out his wallet and handed over his driver's license. The younger officer took it and frowned. "James Carter, what brings you to this area?" "I live here now," James replied calmly. "Just moved into town." The officers exchanged a quick glance, their suspicions clearly not eased. "You see," the younger officer said, pointing toward the gas station, "we've had reports of some thefts in this area. A guy matching your description was seen leaving the scene earlier this week." James raised an eyebrow, surprised by the vague accusation. "Matching my description? That's interesting. What exactly does that mean?" The older officer cleared his throat, perhaps sensing the conversation was heading into tricky territory. "We're just following up, sir. If you don't mind, we'll need to ask you a few more questions." James took a deep breath. He could feel the heat of the sun on his back, and the situation wasn't sitting well with him. But he also knew that losing his temper wouldn't help. "Go ahead," he said, leaning against his car. The younger officer walked around James' car, inspecting it like he was searching for something out of place. "This car yours?" "It belonged to my father," James replied. "I'm just using it for now." The younger officer smirked. "Old cars like this aren't common around here. Where'd you say you're from?" James crossed his arms. "I didn't say. But if you must know, I've worked in law enforcement for years. Moved here to start fresh." The older officer looked surprised. "Law enforcement? Where?" Before James could answer, the younger officer interrupted. "Look, we're going to need you to come with us. Just a routine check." James straightened, feeling his patience being tested. "And why exactly am I being detained?" "Like I said," the younger officer replied, "you match the description of someone we're looking for. It's better to clear things up at the station." James could feel the situation slipping into dangerous territory. He decided to cooperate, knowing he needed to maintain his composure. "All right," he said, "but I'd like to call someone first." "No calls," the younger officer said quickly. "You'll have your chance later." The older officer hesitated but ultimately nodded in agreement. They opened the back door of the patrol car and motioned for James to get in. James stepped inside, the heat inside the car almost unbearable. As the door slammed shut behind him, he sat quietly, observing the officers from the backseat. Little did they know, the man they had just locked in the car wasn't just anyone. He was their new sheriff, and the truth was about to come out in a way they'd never expect. The patrol car's interior felt like an oven. The scorching midday sun beat down on the vehicle, turning it into a metal box of heat. James sat quietly in the backseat, his hands resting on his knees. Beads of sweat began to form on his forehead, but he kept his expression calm. Years of experience in law enforcement had taught him the value of patience, even in the most frustrating situations. Outside, the two officers stood by their patrol car, talking in low voices. James couldn't hear their conversation, but their glances toward him made it clear they were discussing him. He leaned back against the seat, letting his mind wander to how he had ended up in this situation. James had spent his entire career working to make law enforcement better. He believed in fairness, justice, and treating people with respect. Sitting in the back of this patrol car, being treated as a suspect without evidence, was a harsh reminder of the work still needed to bridge gaps in understanding and trust. The younger officer, who seemed more suspicious and assertive, walked over to James' car. He began peeking through the windows, as if looking for something to justify their actions. He opened the driver's side door and rifled through the glove compartment. James' jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Meanwhile, the older officer approached the patrol car and leaned against the door. "So, James," he said, his tone casual, "you mentioned you worked in law enforcement. What kind of work did you do?" James looked up at him, his expression neutral. "I was a detective for 10 years. Before that, I worked as a beat cop. I've seen it all, good and bad." The officer raised an eyebrow. "A detective, huh? What brought you to Montville County?" James hesitated for a moment. "I was offered a position here. Figured it was time for a change." The officer nodded but didn't press further. He seemed thoughtful, as if trying to piece something together. At the same time, the younger officer returned, holding an old notebook he had found in James' car. "What's this?" he asked, waving it in the air. James glanced at it and recognized it immediately. "That's my father's. It's full of notes he kept about his life. Nothing to do with you." The younger officer smirked. "Mind if we take a closer look? You never know what might be in there." James took a deep breath, his patience wearing thin. "I do mind. That's personal property, and you have no reason to go through it." The older officer seemed uneasy about the younger one's actions but didn't intervene. The heat and tension were rising, both inside and outside the car. As James sat in the stifling heat, he noticed his hands starting to feel clammy, his shirt sticking to his back. The officers, standing outside in the fresh air, didn't seem to care about the conditions he was enduring. James thought about revealing who he was, ending this situation immediately. But part of him wanted to see how far they would go, how they treated someone they thought was powerless. He wasn't just testing them. He was testing the system they represented. The younger officer leaned against the patrol car, glancing at his partner. "Let's take him to the station. We can sort this out there." The older officer nodded reluctantly. As the car's engine roared to life, James braced himself for what lay ahead. He didn't know how this would end, but one thing was clear. He wasn't just a man in the backseat. He was the new sheriff, and his time to reveal the truth was coming. The ride to the station felt long. James could feel the heat pressing in from all sides, making the air inside the patrol car thick and sticky. His shirt clung to his back, his skin feeling like it was burning in the hot sun. He glanced out the window, watching the quiet streets of Montville pass by. The small town seemed peaceful, almost serene. But not for him. Not right now. As the car hummed along, James sat silently in the back. He didn't want to cause trouble, but he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in his gut. He had been wrongly detained, treated like a criminal, when in reality, he was about to be the one running the law in this town. But no one knew that yet. He knew he had to stay calm. The clock was ticking, and he had a feeling that every second was going to count. His hands were starting to feel clammy, and his mouth was dry. It wasn't just the heat that made him uncomfortable. It was the feeling of helplessness, the feeling of being trapped. He had always prided himself on being in control, but now, in the back of this car, he was at the mercy of people who had no idea who he was. The younger officer kept glancing in the rearview mirror, his eyes darting back and forth between James and the road. The older officer, who had been more polite at first, now seemed lost in thought, his mind elsewhere. James wondered if the older officer was starting to doubt his partner's decision, but there was no way to know for sure. As the car drove on, James' thoughts wandered to his new role as sheriff. He had always dreamed of leading a department, of making a real difference, but never in his wildest dreams had he imagined his first day on the job would start like this. His phone was in his pocket, but the younger officer had made it clear that he couldn't make any calls. It felt wrong, like they were trying to keep him in the dark, keep him powerless. James had known moments of struggle before, but this felt different. He wasn't just fighting for justice anymore. He was fighting for the truth to be heard. The town was getting closer, and the pressure inside the car seemed to grow heavier with each passing mile. James knew he needed to find a way out of this. He had to reveal who he was, but he didn't want to jump the gun too soon. If he did, he risked looking like he was trying to cover up something. No, he had to wait for the right moment. The younger officer cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "You think you'll be staying here for long?" he asked, glancing at James once more. James didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a slow breath and looked out the window. "I'll be here as long as it takes to get things right." The younger officer raised an eyebrow, not sure what to make of the answer. He looked back at the older officer, who nodded in agreement, though still appeared a little unsure of how to handle the situation. James watched the familiar streets of Montville slowly approach as the patrol car turned onto the main road. His mind raced, and his heart beat faster. He was moments away from either revealing his identity and ending this madness, or continuing to play along with their mistake. The clock was ticking, but he knew he had to be smart about it. One wrong move could change everything. As the sheriff's office came into view, James took a deep breath. His moment was coming, and he would make sure he took the right step at the right time. There was no turning back now. The patrol car finally pulled up in front of the Montville County Sheriff's Office. The building was a simple one-story structure with a small parking lot in front. James could feel the weight of the situation pressing on him as the car stopped. The younger officer got out first, looking around before coming around to open the back door where James sat. "Let's go," the officer said in a firm voice, still not recognizing who James truly was. James got out slowly, trying to keep his cool. The air outside felt a little better than inside the car, but it was still warm. His shirt clung to his back, and he could feel the sweat trickling down his neck. The younger officer grabbed his arm, guiding him toward the building with a grip that was a little firmer than necessary. Inside the sheriff's office, the small space was buzzing with activity. Deputies were answering phones, filing papers, and talking amongst themselves. James couldn't help but notice how busy it seemed, even though Montville was such a quiet town. The sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway as they made their way toward the holding area. The older officer followed behind them, his face looking more unsure with each passing minute. It was clear that something about this whole situation didn't sit right with him. He kept glancing at James, then back at his partner, but didn't say a word. As they reached the holding area, the younger officer motioned for James to sit on a bench. He kept a hand on his shoulder, as if worried James might try to run. James sat down, his patience now wearing thin. He could feel the tension in the air, the feeling that something was about to shift. The older officer walked over to one of the desks, where a deputy was typing away at a computer. He leaned in to speak to her, and James could hear bits and pieces of the conversation. It seemed like the officer was asking her to run some background checks on him. The younger officer stayed by James, eyeing him carefully. James leaned back on the bench, crossing his arms. He didn't speak, but his mind was racing. He had to reveal who he was soon, but he wanted to wait until he could make the biggest impact. He wasn't just some man they had locked up in a car. He was their new sheriff, and it was time for them to know. Just as the tension in the room grew thick, the door to the office opened. A deputy stepped in, her eyes locking onto James. She paused for a moment, then her expression shifted from confusion to surprise. "Wait a second," the deputy said, her voice rising. She looked at James closely, her gaze softening. The younger officer turned sharply. "What's going on?" The deputy stepped forward, holding a folder. "That's James Carter, the new sheriff," she said, her voice clear. The room fell silent. The younger officer looked at James, then back at the deputy, his face going pale. The older officer froze as well, both of them now realizing the mistake they had made. James stood up slowly, his eyes meeting the deputy's. "That's right. I'm the new sheriff, and you two have just locked me in your patrol car under the sun without even knowing who I was." The younger officer stammered. I didn't know." James raised a hand to stop him. "I understand, but I expect better from this department. I expect better from all of you." The older officer swallowed hard, his face red with embarrassment. "Sir, I'm so sorry. We didn't." James held up a hand again. "I know, but you'll need to make this right." The deputy, still looking surprised, stepped forward. "I'll inform the rest of the team. They need to know who you are immediately." James nodded. "I appreciate that. Now, I expect things to be handled with the respect they deserve." The room was quiet for a moment longer, the weight of the discovery hanging in the air. James had made his point, and now it was time for the officers to learn the truth and learn how to treat the new sheriff with the respect he had earned. The silence in the sheriff's office felt heavy as the reality of what had just happened began to settle in. The younger officer stood frozen, his face pale and filled with shock. The older officer, who had seemed so confident just moments ago, was now looking down at his shoes, clearly embarrassed. James could feel the tension in the room, but he kept his expression neutral, refusing to let his frustration show too much. The deputy, who had recognized James, quickly stepped forward, motioning for the officers to step aside. "We need to have a meeting," she said in a serious tone. "Right now." The younger officer nodded quickly, his hand shaking as he moved to follow her. The older officer lingered for a moment longer, clearly unsure of what to say, but then he, too, followed her toward the back room. James stood alone in the small holding area, trying to process what had just happened. He had been locked in the back of a patrol car, treated like a criminal, only to find out that he was their new sheriff. The irony wasn't lost on him. For a moment, he thought about what his father would say. He had always taught him to rise above challenges, to never let anyone take away his dignity. James had done just that. He had stayed calm, kept his head cool, and now it was time for the officers to realize the mistake they had made. As he stood there, waiting, he couldn't help but think about the consequences of their actions. It wasn't just about him. It was about the message they had sent to the people they were meant to protect and serve. This wasn't just an isolated mistake. It was a problem that went deeper, one that needed to be addressed right away. After a few minutes, the deputy returned, her expression serious. She glanced at James briefly before turning toward the two officers, who were now sitting at a table in the back. "They're waiting for you," she said. James nodded and walked toward the room where the officers were seated. As he entered, the younger officer immediately stood up. "Sheriff, I..." He paused, his voice cracking with a mixture of fear and regret. "I'm sorry. I didn't know who you were. I should have handled it better." James held up a hand to stop him. "I understand your mistake. What I don't understand is why you didn't take the time to ask the right questions before you treated me this way." The older officer spoke up, his voice low and apologetic. "You're right, Sheriff. We should have handled it differently. We've been working here for years, but we shouldn't have made assumptions like that. It was a mistake." James studied the two officers, his expression stern but not unkind. "Mistakes happen. But the truth is, you made me feel small. You locked me in a car under the sun like I wasn't a person. That's not how we serve the public." The younger officer hung his head, his shoulders slumped. "We won't let it happen again, Sheriff. I swear." James nodded, still keeping his voice steady. "Good. This department needs respect and integrity, not just from the citizens, but from the officers who work here too." He paused for a moment, allowing his words to sink in. "I'm here to work with all of you, to lead, and to make this place better. But I can't do that if we don't have mutual trust." The room was quiet, each of them reflecting on the weight of what had just occurred. Finally, the older officer stood up and extended his hand. "We'll do better, Sheriff. We'll make sure this department is a place everyone can trust." James took his hand and shook it firmly. "That's all I ask." As he left the room, James felt a sense of resolution. He had made his point. Now, it was time to focus on the future. He was the new sheriff, and the real work was just beginning. The day had not gone as James had planned. What was supposed to be a calm start to his new role as sheriff had turned into a frustrating, uncomfortable ordeal. Yet, as he sat in his office later that afternoon, he couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet satisfaction. He had handled the situation with dignity, and the officers who had made the mistake were now fully aware of their misstep. It had been a wake-up call for everyone. James looked around his new office, still adjusting to the reality of being in charge. The walls were bare, except for a few framed photos of past sheriffs and a small American flag in the corner. The desk was cluttered with papers, some still in need of his attention, while others could wait. He ran a hand through his hair, thinking about the future. He knew that his work was just beginning. The moment he had stepped into the sheriff's office, the challenges had started. There was much to do, from building relationships with his team to earning the trust of the community. The town was small, but it was close-knit, and things like this, mistakes by the police, could have lasting effects. He had to make sure that the officers under his command knew what he stood for and how he expected them to treat the people they served. As he sifted through some files on his desk, he heard a knock at the door. "Come in," James called, his voice steady. The door opened, and Deputy Sarah Parker stepped inside. She was the same deputy who had recognized him earlier, and James couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude toward her. She had been the first one to make things right. "Sheriff," she said with a small smile, "I just wanted to check in and make sure everything's okay. I know today was unexpected." James nodded, appreciating her concern. "I'm fine. It's just one of those days, you know. But I think it might have been a good thing in the end." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "You mean getting locked in a patrol car?" James chuckled softly. "Exactly. I think it was a reminder for everyone here about the importance of treating people with respect and not making assumptions." Sarah smiled, though there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. "It's not just today. There's a lot of work to be done in this town. People don't always trust the department, especially after some of the things that have happened in the past." James leaned back in his chair, his hands folded in front of him. He had known about the tension, about the fractured relationship between the department and the community. But hearing it from Sarah made it feel real, like it was something that had to be fixed, not just talked about. "I know," he said quietly. "That's something we'll have to work on together. But trust takes time. I'm not asking for it all at once. I'm just asking for a chance." Sarah nodded. "I think you've got it. We're behind you, Sheriff, but it won't be easy." James stood up from his desk, walking over to the window that overlooked the quiet town. The streets were starting to fill with people getting off work, and the sound of a few kids laughing in the distance reached his ears. It was a peaceful scene, but underneath it all, there was a deep need for change. "I didn't take this job because I wanted power," he said, his voice thoughtful. "I took it because I want to help, to make things better for everyone, officers and the people we serve." Sarah watched him for a moment, then smiled. "I believe you, and I think the town will too. It just takes time." James nodded. "Time, yes, but we'll get there, one step at a time." As Sarah left the office, James felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just going to be the sheriff of Montville County. He was going to be the sheriff who made a difference. There would be challenges ahead, but James was ready. He had already faced the hardest test of all. Now he was prepared for everything that came next. The sun had begun to set over Montville County, casting a golden glow over the streets. James stood on the steps of the sheriff's office, his hands resting in his pockets as he watched the small town slowly come to life in the evening light. It had been a long day, full of unexpected challenges, but it had also been a day of progress. He felt a sense of relief wash over him. The officers who had made the mistake were now fully aware of his role, and the department was starting to understand what he expected from them. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was a start. James took a deep breath and looked out at the town. There was work to be done, yes, but it was work he was ready for. The trust between the police department and the community needed to be rebuilt, and he was determined to lead the way. He wasn't going to rush it, but he wasn't going to waste time either. As he turned back toward the door, he heard footsteps behind him. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. "You look deep in thought, Sheriff," Sarah's voice called out. James smiled and turned to face her. "Just thinking about the future," he replied. "It's a lot to handle, but I'm ready." Sarah joined him on the steps, looking out at the town with him. "I know you are. You've already shown you've got the courage to do what's needed. I think people are starting to see that." James nodded. "It's not about courage, Sarah. It's about doing the right thing. And sometimes, doing the right thing isn't the easiest path." Sarah chuckled softly. "That's true. But I think this town will respect that. And they'll respect you." James looked at her, a sense of gratitude in his heart. Sarah had been the one to help him get through today's chaos. She was one of the few people in this department who understood the importance of change. "I hope so," James said quietly. "I want to lead by example. I want people to know that I'll always be fair with them, and that I'll work just as hard as they do to make things better." Sarah smiled. "You're already doing that. People will come around." The evening air was cooling, and the town was settling into its usual rhythm. James could hear the faint hum of traffic in the distance, the sound of families gathering for dinner, and the laughter of children playing outside. It was peaceful, and for the first time that day, James felt at peace as well. "I know it's going to take time," he said, looking at Sarah, "but we'll get there, one step at a time." Sarah gave him a knowing look. "That's the right attitude. And don't forget, you've got a team behind you." James nodded, grateful for the support. "Thanks, Sarah. I couldn't do it without you." As Sarah walked away, James stayed on the steps for a moment longer, taking in the quiet beauty of the evening. He had faced many challenges in his life, but this was different. This wasn't just about law enforcement. It was about the people, about the community, and about creating a future where everyone could trust one another. James was determined to make that future a reality. He wasn't just the sheriff of Montville County now. He was the sheriff who was going to lead the way, making things better for everyone, one day at a time. The road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but with hard work, patience, and a commitment to fairness, he knew he could get there. This was only the beginning, and James was ready to face whatever came next. A week had passed since the incident at the gas station, and James had settled into his new role as sheriff. The tension in the office had gradually faded, but there was still a sense of uncertainty that hung in the air. It was clear that things had changed, but how much had truly shifted? James spent his days meeting with community leaders, talking to local business owners, and getting to know the people who called Montville County home. He was determined to build a foundation of trust, and he knew that the only way to do that was by listening first, acting second. He spent hours reviewing cases and talking with his deputies, ensuring that the department was running smoothly and fairly. He knew that the events of his first day had made an impact on everyone, especially the officers who had been involved. They had learned a valuable lesson, but James also understood that it would take time for them to regain their confidence and find their footing under his leadership. One afternoon, James sat down with the two officers who had locked him in the car. He had asked them to come into his office, and when they arrived, they both looked uneasy, as if they were still unsure of how to face him. But James wasn't angry anymore. He was focused on moving forward. "Sit down," he said calmly, gesturing to the chairs in front of his desk. "We need to talk." The younger officer, who had been the most suspicious during the incident, spoke first. "Sheriff, we just wanted to apologize again for how everything went down. We were wrong. We're ready to work hard and prove ourselves." James nodded. "I appreciate that. But this isn't just about proving yourselves to me. It's about proving yourselves to the people of this town. You've got to understand why what happened was so wrong. Not just for me, but for everyone who trusts us to do our jobs right." The older officer shifted in his seat. "We know, Sheriff. We understand. We were quick to judge and didn't take the time to listen. That's something we're going to work on." James looked both of them in the eye, making sure they understood the gravity of their words. "I want you both to take this seriously. If you're going to wear this badge, you need to do more than just enforce the law. You need to be role models for the community. You need to be fair, and you need to be people that others can trust. If you can't do that, then we've got a bigger problem." The younger officer nodded, his face showing a hint of determination. "We'll do better, Sheriff. We won't let you down again." James could tell that they were sincere. They had made a mistake, but they were learning from it. That was all he could ask for. "Good," he said. "Now let's move forward. I'm counting on you both." As the officers left his office, James leaned back in his chair, feeling a small sense of pride. He had done what he came here to do. He had made sure the department understood the importance of respect, fairness, and honesty. But more than that, he had made sure that the community was starting to trust the people who were meant to protect them. James knew that his job wasn't finished. There would be more challenges, more lessons to learn. But as he looked out the window at the town below, he felt confident that he was on the right path. This was more than just about being sheriff. It was about leading with integrity, making sure that everyone in Montville County knew they were valued, that they were heard. He was ready for whatever came next, because in the end, he knew that the lesson he had learned was the same one the department needed to understand. Respect, fairness, and trust were the foundations of any community, and they couldn't be built overnight. But with hard work and dedication, they could last a lifetime. And that was what mattered most.